Hey everyone, and welcome back to Combat Mission Strength and Power for a bit of an autopsy. Obviously there's spoilers ahead here for the first mission of the campaign, so if you want it to all be a surprise, go watch something else. Now that I've played through the mission, I've been able to hop onto YouTube and compare how I did to how other people have done, which is always fun. And broadly speaking, it seems that everyone's had a similar result. They didn't win because they moved forward and occupied all of the terrain objectives. They won because they punished the Russians so heavily they surrendered. The big difference is that I lost more men than most, and I'm going to be picking that disaster apart. But first, how did my overall tactical concept pan out, and what other options did I have? I decided to focus on the government complex because I figured it was a chunk of key terrain. Whoever held it would have the advantage on the map. Obviously, I'm fighting down a valley here, so it figures that the valley bottom isn't the place to be, but the right-hand valley side is higher, and not only can you dominate the government complex from up there, but seizing that ground doesn't involve the kind of high casualty, let's go clear that big complex of buildings that storming the government complex does. And some other people have taken the right flank route and they've done it very successfully, but I threw it out for a few reasons. The first is that the slope is really heavily forested, so it's impassable to vehicles, and you get these bottlenecks at the top and when you want to come down on the other side. So pushing up that way would involve restricting the movements of my pretty small force, which is bad at the kind of minor tactical level because those bottlenecks make good ambush sites, both close ambushes, for example by RPG teams in the trees, and distant fire ambushes from tanks, ATGM teams, the ATGMs on the BMP-2Ms, at a distance much further away on the other side of the map. And if you jump up a level to the overall kind of tactical picture, I feel like I'd lose a lot of flexibility because units up there are pretty much committed. It's going to take a while for them to reorientate, to get into positions where they can properly cover the centre or the left if they need to. Another factor that I just touched on is that the forest is a big, effective chunk of concealment for infantry, and that makes it a danger area. Sure, the scout Humvee got up there with no problems, but that hardly means that enemy forces haven't moved up in the meantime. Working on the assumption that there's something there, which is a pretty sensible, reasonable assumption, actually moving up around the edge of the forest becomes difficult to do while maintaining some kind of overwatch, simply because of the layout of the map and the map edge. So most of my forces going up there would have to be exposing their flanks to potential enemy infantry in the forest, and it wouldn't be very easy for the forces on Overwatch, down at the bottom of the hill for example, to deal with that enemy infantry. As it happened, that forest was completely clear, and people in other playthroughs have rolled right past it with no problems whatsoever, and there's a totally legitimate argument that because this is a meeting engagement and most of the initial enemy recce screen spots are very close to the main road, chances are the enemy hasn't got any recce troops as far forward as that forest edge. So you can calculate that while the forest is a danger area, it's probably a low risk danger area. By comparison though, the left hand side of the valley is very open, it's very easy to get observation on it, it's very easy to put fire on anything that pops up there. So to me, the left hand flank is a much better kind of operating area than the right hand flank. The final point is to do with the shape of the slope on the right hand side of the valley. Height is really important, but this is a concave slope, and that means that my forces at the top of the hill can't actually see down into the valley bottom. A core component of this mission is to stop the Russians from advancing. If the bulk of my combat power is up on top of the hill and can't see the main road, it can't cover the main road, what's to stop the enemy from just bum rushing straight down there and just bypassing me while I'm stuck on the other side of the forest? Of course, I'm not likely to sit still on top of the hill if that's happening. I'd be coming down the slope to get the angle to engage the enemy, but The engagement ranges are going to be shorter, there's less cover and concealment for me, there's more cover and concealment for the enemy, and that's really just increasing the risk of having my forces up there. This also feeds into my interpretation of what the Russians were doing. I got some very early spots of enemy tanks on the right hand flank, and then the drone later confirmed that they were down in that valley on the far right. And I have to consider the fact that if I have forces on top of the right hand hill and those Russian tanks come up the hill, because of the nature of the slope, the concave slope, the Russians are going to be able to get very close before either side sees the other one and we get the engagement. So very short engagement range. That's where the Russians have their greatest chance because of the technical differences between the units. Because of the strengths of the Abrams, for example, being at range, I want to keep T-72s as far away as possible. The T-72s, if they want to live and kill Abrams, they need to get up close and engage at very close range. So all the way through, and especially with the Abrams, I wanted to be engaging the enemy at arm's length, as far away as possible. So that kind of foreseeable close range engagement up on the top of the right hand valley side isn't something that I wanted to get into. It's something I wanted to avoid because that would give the Russians the greatest chance of actually taking out some of my tanks. So that's my justification for not going right. Like I said though, it's worked for other people, and my plan of going for the government complex and staying on the left has its own problems. Speaking of the attack on the government complex, the beauty of saving every turn in a single player combat mission game is that I can go back and do it again. Obviously, I didn't do that when I played through the mission because, well, what's the point? But I can go back now and I can go and try again and see what would happen if I did things differently. So, for example, I can give almost exactly the same orders to the Bradleys attacking the government complex. I can just tweak them a little bit, bring the left hand and right hand Bradleys in ever so slightly so they don't get spotted, give the infantry orders to disembark when the vehicle stops. And the end result is a single casualty from small arms fire. What happens after getting that toehold in the government complex is a different question entirely, and I'll get to that. But what this shows is that that final bound to the government complex from where the Bradleys were stacking up, whatever flaws it had, and believe me, there was a lot wrong with that, it was not automatically doomed. It wasn't some kind of disaster waiting to happen. It could have gone off without a hitch. So, to some extent, I could argue that I was just unlucky, but it's not like I can blame bad luck. When I'm giving bad luck, lots of opportunities to get stuck in and make bad things happen. So let's go back to the overall plan and look at the idea of actually attacking the government complex. Yes, in my opinion, it's better than the right-hand flank and the centre, and yes, it's a good position from which I can dominate the other objectives, but there's a lot of floor space to clear in there. If it's occupied by the enemy, it's going to be difficult to clear out with my small force. I really can't afford the casualties of room-to-room urban warfare. So even though I saw, and still see, the government complex as a piece of key terrain I needed to control, was I really biting off more than I could chew by sending a single Bradley platoon up there? And the answer is, it depends when the platoon gets there. Another byproduct of having all the turns saved is that I can go to turn 22, the pre-disaster turn, and ceasefire, and that'll show me exactly where all the Russian forces were. In the government complex, at that time, there were a few badly battered Russian recce troops, and I literally managed to park each of the two Bradleys that got taken out in front of the only Russian recce troops that had any anti-tank weapons left. So yeah, bad luck there. But the point is that that's not an insurmountable challenge for a Bradley platoon. Fast forward a minute or two and you can see there's this Russian motor rifle platoon coming up the valley side to reinforce those recce troops at the government complex. So if the Bradley platoon arrives when those guys have got in there, we've got a serious problem, and it's far too much for them to handle. So thinking about an attack on the complex in that context, I actually timed it almost perfectly. The Brads rolled up literally 1 or 2 turns before the motor rifle dismounts moved into the buildings, when the Russian recce troops were at their most battered. They'd been hammered by the Abrams and the artillery and the Bradleys, and when it was easiest for that Bradley platoon to get that foothold, that toehold in the complex that I wanted. Factor in some effective blocking artillery like we got in later, and suddenly the whole concept works and I look like some kind of tactical genius. So because this is a meeting engagement and reinforcements from both sides keep coming in, if I'd been able to move in and occupy the government complex before Russian main force units got there, if I was still just dealing with the recce screen, I think it would have been pretty doable. And of course I was taking that risk when I moved in. It didn't pay off. These things happen. And to some extent, I don't know what else I would have done apart from attack the government complex. At this stage in the game, I'm still pretty committed to moving forward. It's a meeting engagement. The big thing for me to do is get a better grip on the terrain, a better grip on the ground than the enemy, so that he has to come and fight me on my terms. Given that I didn't want to push up the middle, and I didn't want to push up the right, not pushing the left would have put me straight onto the defensive pretty much from the word go. And there is mileage in that approach, especially in hindsight, and reading the briefing, a fairly reasonable plan of action would be to set an ambush, be on the defensive from the word go, set an ambush to destroy that Russian armoured spearhead, and then mop up afterwards. But given the time pressure, the amount of ground I had to secure, the fact that however likely I can't count 100% on the enemy being so helpful as to come to me, I don't think a full-on defence from turn 1 fits the bill. If the enemy hadn't surrendered here, it seems very unlikely that I've gotten all the objectives. Down to the details of the government complex assault as it actually went in, there's really 3 big things wrong with it. First of all, and by far the most important thing, is that the Bradleys went in without fire superiority, or the possibility of quickly gaining fire superiority from supporting forces. In other words, the Brads went in on their own with no covering fire and no overwatch. In the previous turn, the Russians in the government complex were getting suppressed and taking casualties from artillery and 120mm tank fire. I had a degree of fire superiority which would probably have enabled the Bradleys to just roll up in relative safety. On the turn the actual assault went in, the artillery had ended, the Abrams had pulled back. I couldn't see the government complex because I was focusing them on the threat of enemy T-72s across the valley. And the fire superiority that was there in the last turn just evaporated. Exactly when the assault force actually needed it. So those Russian recce troops were suddenly not cowering in their buildings. They had maybe a 30-second window to pull themselves together, stand up, get those RPG-18s out. And that's enough time for the defence to go from suppressed to dangerously viable. Secondly, I didn't send any of my own recce out. Sure, I had the place under drone observation, sure I'd hammered all the spotted enemy positions and a few suspect positions with tanks and artillery, but what I didn't do is send some sacrificial pixel tripping out to see if it was safe. There's a saying that floats around the Battlefront forums and the Few Good Men, which is, never send a squad anywhere you haven't sent a scout team, never send a platoon anywhere you haven't sent a squad, and never send a company anywhere you haven't sent a platoon. In other words, recce is God. Best practice is to make contact with the enemy with as small a force as possible, both to keep your inevitable casualties down and to keep the amount of intel the enemy gets down to a minimum. It's just common sense. I didn't do it here. There's a few reasons for that. My own fire support for one, time pressure for another. Even though I had a pretty good idea of what to expect in the government complex, I still got bitten. Thirdly, I was impatient, and I got the Bradleys into a position where I felt I had to attack with them. I rolled that platoon into this staging area here pretty much as early as I could, and then when I got worried about them being a juicy artillery target, I only thought to attack earlier, not pull back and disperse into some of the other available cover. That was really the catalyst for the whole thing, and it would have been a lot smarter to move a single Bradley and squad up to check that area out, then hold the rest back where they were, properly coordinate the actual assault with the artillery and the tanks, only moving up into the staging area at the last possible moment. You know, more common sense. So overall, I'd say the biggest issue with the government complex was that I just didn't pay enough attention to it. If I'd said to myself, this is the main effort, and worked it as a proper, deliberate attack, then I think I would have handled it a lot better. As it was, my attention was being pulled in a few different directions. I wanted to assault the government complex with my 1st Bradley platoon, I wanted to stabilise the position of my 2nd Bradley platoon down in the centre, and I wanted my tanks and Apaches to focus on destroying enemy armour. And I wanted to do all this at the same time. To be fair, I could do all that at the same time to some extent. Like I've shown, the government complex assault wasn't automatically doomed, but juggling everything makes it more likely that poor judgments and mistakes are going to creep in. And when you make mistakes in Combat Mission Black Sea, terrible things happen. So that's the bad stuff dealt with. But I still won, the Russians still got hammered, and realistically, my casualties could have been an awful lot worse. So, what did I do right, and what did I do that worked? First of all, I pretty much have to say that playing as the US with Apaches, and drones, and Abrams, and Bradleys is probably the closest that Combat Mission gets to some kind of easy difficulty. Going all the way down to the technical level of war here, so beneath tactical, when you have a piece of kit like the Abrams that can spot an enemy tank at 2,000 meters, is almost guaranteed to hit and destroy the target on the first shot, and can go through its engagement cycle very quickly, you could argue that it's actually pretty difficult to screw this up. So while I did have, or the scenario designer gave me, a very real, borderline unfair technical advantage, it was still important to make the most out of that advantage, and the real key to that were the drones. Effective reconnaissance is like being able to see your opponent's cards in a game of poker, so whenever the Russians made a move here, I was able to shift my forces or send in the Apaches pretty much exactly where they were needed. The one drone goof I had goes back to the government complex, which shouldn't be a surprise. I had a drone up there eyeballing the place, and while it did spot the Russian recce vehicles up there, it was never going to spot any infantry in the buildings, and it would have been much smarter, once those recce vehicles had been spotted, for me to shuffle the drone to cover the dead zone in the valley behind the government complex, exactly where that Russian motor rifle platoon with a T-72 backing them up were massing. If I'd seen the Russians were determined to advance on both flanks a little bit earlier, I could have made that vital transition from an aggressive, attacking, must take this ground mindset to a defending, come and get me mindset a little bit earlier. And that's the change in mindset that I think really made the difference here. When I saw the Russians coming in via the drones, I could sit there and say, okay, that works for me, and switch over to the defense, let the Russians come forward where I could destroy them on my terms. Yes, I've gone on about the government complex as a piece of key terrain, and that value still stands, but if I'd known that the enemy was going to be moving into it before I could get that Bradley platoon set up in there, I could have said, okay, we're going to move on to the defensive that little bit earlier, keep that Bradley platoon on the reverse slope, and drop a very long blocking artillery barrage on top of the government complex to deny it to the enemy. So even if they do then get in there, they're not going to be able to take advantage of it. And this pretty much folds into what I think's the overall experience of the mission in itself. As I played it, and as other people have played it, the key thing here is that destroying the enemy is more important than holding the ground. Ground is important, but only in the sense that it's something you use and exploit to destroy the enemy. After all, if the other guy gets wiped out or surrenders, then, well, you're going to get the ground anyway. And I might have been a little bit too focused on moving forward in this mission when I didn't have to. Obviously, that's very easy to say in hindsight, and I couldn't be sure the enemy would effectively destroy himself by throwing himself at me. And I think that all the decisions I made were pretty solid and defensible, with the 50-50 exception of the assault on the government complex. 50-50 because it was pretty dumb and pretty risky, but at the same time I could have gotten away with it, and it would have been extremely good if I could have pulled it off with a little bit more care. So that's my thoughts, guys. I hope you found that interesting. If you think I missed anything or you have any questions, then post a comment, let me know, and I'll see you in the next mission, where all those dead pixel trepping at the government complex will be really handy right about now.